This is Åland, a demilitarised, Swedish-speaking archipelago that is part of the country of Finland. I've been wanting to come here for ages because I have so many questions about it. Why is it Swedish-speaking? How autonomous is it? And why is it demilitarised? So in this video, I'm going to be exploring all of this as I travel around the islands and the capital, Mariehamn. Now, to get here, I took a ferry from Helsinki, and in a couple of days, I'm taking one back to Stockholm. So let's cut to a bit earlier this morning when I had just arrived on Åland. Now, my plans to see the Åland Islands by bus are being somewhat scuppered already. I'd come here to get the 7:55 bus to take me to Kastelholm, or a little bit further east even. And it's on the timetable, but it's not on the screen. And it's past 7:55 and there's no bus turned up. So decided I'm going to go get a coffee instead. Drink that, hopefully wake up a bit, and then get the 9:30 to Kastelholm. I think this is one of those places where life is quite a lot easier if you have a car. Right, after a bit of a false start this morning, I think I've secured a car rental for 6 hours. When I looked online earlier, it said it was going to cost about 130 quid for a car for a day, but actually I just spoke to them on the phone and they're doing it for just over 40 euros for 6 hours. Now I just need to remember to drive on the right side of the road, or should I say the wrong side of the road? Joking. So I've drove about 7 kilometres north of Mariehamn, and I've come to Jamolla Church, or St Olaf's Church as it's otherwise known. Swedish people first came here in the 12th century for missionary purposes. And this church dates back to around 1260 to 1280. So when the Swedish missionaries came to Åland, they would have wanted a place to worship, and this was the first one that they built. Now, as Åland is completely Swedish speaking, all of the services here will still be in Swedish to this day. I noticed as well, as I'm looking around the graveyard, a lot of the names are in Swedish too. So we've got Karlsson there. We've got a few Karlssons actually. I don't know if they're in the same family. We've got Mattsson there, Mansson, Hagström over there, Johansson. So despite the islands being part of Finland for over 200 years, the names still do sound very Swedish. The Swedish did plan some renovations when they were in power, but these never came to play. But actually the islands were under Russian control after Swedish control. We're going to go into all of that later. And the Russians actually did adapt this church. So some of it is expanded, but a lot of it dates back to the 13th century, which makes it quite likely the oldest church in Finland. I then made it to Kastelholm Castle. Now, to understand this 14th century castle's history, you need to first understand Åland's history. Let's start at the very beginning, I guess. These islands have been inhabited since the Stone Age. There's been archaeological finds of early settlements and trading. They were Christianised from around the 12th century, which is when the Swedish first appeared here. Swedish missionaries came to the island and spread their religion. Swedish became the dominant language very early on, and we'll go back to that in a bit. So the islands were under Swedish control for around 600 years, and they played a really significant role in Sweden's Baltic defence network. One of the ways that they did this was they built Kastelholm Castle, which is right beside me. So let's have a little look in the castle and see how Swedish it feels. Dating back to the 14th century, this is the only castle in Åland, and it's one of only 5 medieval castles in all of Finland. Today it is connected to, well, not the mainland, but another island. But it was actually originally built on a small island surrounded by moats. And it was very important for both military purposes and administrative purposes. But it was remodelled a lot throughout the years, particularly during the 17th century. And the structures were built kind of to fit in with the rock configuration. So if you don't know, the Swedish Empire was vast during the medieval and early modern age. In fact, until the 19th century, it controlled a lot of the Baltics, including most of modern-day Finland. So it was natural that Sweden occupied these islands, but they were a really unique place being in the middle of the two countries. But Sweden was worried about the threat of countries around it, increasingly Russia. This isn't necessarily exact, but this is kind of how similar castles looked during the 1600s, 15 and 1600s. but it's not known exactly what this castle looked like on the inside. Now, despite the Åland Islands feeling a little bit remote, the castle was home to a few different battles. It was besieged in 1453 under the Engelbrekt Rebellion, which was against the Swedish Empire, and the Kalmar Union, which was a union of countries, largely Denmark, Norway. But after that it was owned by royalty mainly. It was used for various purposes, including being owned by the Swedish crown. It had a shipyard, and it was also a prison at one point. And then in the 1930s, so onwards a bit, it was used as a granary and a quarry. Eric XIV was imprisoned here, former Swedish king. He was incarcerated by his half-brother and then imprisoned in various places throughout Sweden. Initially Stockholm, but then they decided they wanted to place him somewhere more high security, and here was one of the places that they chose. Being an island, not connected to the mainland, it's harder for him to escape. This is he, I think. There's so many little nooks and crannies here. It's really interesting. I'd like to get all the way up to the top and see what they were defending. Now, I'm guessing, like everywhere in Finland when the Russians took over, I'm guessing that they just then carried on using this for defensive purposes. I don't believe there were many adaptations once the Russians took over. This had been standing for so long, so it was probably quite robust. Now, from the top area of this castle, I mean, the building's quite high, so we do have a decent view. But I'm guessing, I think it was just built where it was, just to reinforce Swedish control over the archipelago. It was relatively close to the natural harbours, and it was in quite a strategic position on its own little island. And it was important for the Swedes to have an administrative centre here, and that's what Kastelholm acted as. If anyone was coming to the islands at all, they would have to go through here, but then it was also kitted out for royal apartments in the later stages of its life. Not 100% sure how I get out, but I kind of figured I'd just keep going down, and we'll see where I end up. Into the dungeons, probably. I just read that the first witch trials in Sweden were held here from 1666, and the prisoners, the women who were accused of witchcraft, were kept here. And like the witch trials in a lot of places all over Europe, they were really harsh with it. Women were very much accused of witchcraft for the slightest, most vaguest examples. The law was very skewed to them, unfortunately. So before a lot of them were burned at the stake, a lot of them were kept here. Now, if you are planning on visiting these islands and are interested in all the logistics of visiting, I am going to write a full blog post about how to visit, what to do, all of my tips, all of my links. So if you want to see that, then scan this QR code, or the link will also be in the description. Right, Kastelholm slot complete, but we still have the prison museum and the open air museum to visit. I think they're both up this way. Castle does look pretty imposing there, doesn't it? It looks very impenetrable. And considering it was first created in the 1300s, obviously it's been adapted a lot over time, but it stood the test of time very well. So up here, we've got the other couple of exhibits. There's a distillery there. Can't do any gin tasting, I'm driving. While Kastelholm was used as a prison, from the late 18th century, this was the prison in the area. And it was used as a prison until 1975. It would have been a prison spanning Swedish, Russian and Finnish rule. So you can see the kind of evolution of the prison rooms here from 1800 through to 1850. Now this looks like it would be alright for one person, but up to 6 people could be in here. This was a 4-person room from 1900. So this was during the Russian time.
The house was built 1784. there were only 2 cells now. Those 2 cells were built later.
And there could be 6 people in...
Yeah, maybe
Really?
8, because
Wow.
some others, they had their children
Really?
inside there too.
Oh.
Jail, maybe in Finland, 8 years in jail. They were transported, the prisoners, down to the ship over the Baltic Sea, and during Russian time even to Siberia.
But were the crimes all different crimes?
Yeah, from there to there.
Yeah.
The children who were here,
Yeah.
they were here because their parents were in prison?
Because the mother was here.
Their mother was here, okay.
Yeah.
Were the children treated well? Were they
Yeah,
nice to them?
better than
Better, okay.
the male.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was not so often children inside.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. But when the king was imprisoned at Kastelholm, that was before this theatre opened?
1571, for 3 months.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, long time before. This way is where the guards lived?
Yeah. Inside the warden.
They were very close to the prisoners.
Yes, it was like that at that time.
Yeah. Is it the same in all prisons?
There were no big prisons.
This was the exercise yard. And this was the flogging pole, which was a punishment pre-World War One. And you can see up there, Vita Björn is the Swedish, and Boinonaktet, I think, is the Cyrillic. That is obviously it in Russian. And the last thing to check out in this area is this open-air museum. So this is a collection of around 20 buildings that were in various places on the island, and it's meant to represent rural living here in the 1920s. So some of these were residences, and then over here we have some farm buildings. This is a traditional farmhouse. Dates back to the late 1800s. So here are some of the farm houses, sheep shed. Still smells a bit like a sheep. The ox stable and the cattle shed. So we've made it to Bomarsund Fortress. So this is the fortress just here. And I mean, it is completely in ruins now, but it was a really interesting and important place at its time. In the 18th century, Sweden was the huge power in the Baltic Sea. It sounds surprising now because most people think of Sweden as a peaceful, neutral country, but it did have a rather large empire at its peak. Now, the other power that was rising at this time was, of course, Russia. In the early 18th century, Russia didn't have any control over the Baltic Sea, and Tsar Peter wanted to change that. So he pretty much went to war with Sweden in what was called the Great North War. And a lot of Swedish lands were captured, most notably St. Petersburg and the area around. And this is where St. Petersburg, the name, comes from. It was named after Tsar Peter. The fighting and the annexing of Sweden's land continued throughout Catherine the Great's rule and into the 19th century. So the Russians were slowly advancing eastwards. And in 1809, they captured Finland and Åland. Now this is very significant because remember, Åland was Swedish up until then, but they captured Finland together with Åland, which kind of put them under the same bracket. We're going to talk more about that later on in the video. So from the early 19th century, Russia was present throughout the island. And from what I've read, during Swedish rule, Åland was a very quiet, rural place. The villagers lived a simple life. They were used to it being Swedish control. They spoke Swedish. It'd been like that for hundreds of years and not much had changed. But the Russians appeared. So the Swedes surrendered the island to the Russians and just left the Ålanders to deal with it, basically. All of a sudden, Ålanders were sharing their island with Russian forces. They were sharing their resources. Many of them had children with Russian soldiers. There were lots of illegitimate children, especially. So it was a period of great change. Russia wanted to fortify the island more and make it known that this is Russia here. So the main thing that they did was build this fort. Built in 1828, this was largely constructed as a fort for Russian troops to live. Look, it's really vast. So this is one wall here, and then the other side is all the way over there. And it was meant to be a fortification, but also a kind of Russian military home. And they wanted it to look very, very grand. They wanted it to look unmistakably Russian and to really represent the control that the country had on the island. But one of the key things about this fort was that because of a reduced workforce, they didn't get round to building the harbour. Then in 1853, the Crimean War started. So the Crimean War was against the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And it was largely because Russia wanted to seize territory in the Black Sea. Obviously, the Russian Empire was absolutely vast and stretched all the way down to there. What the Russians didn't expect was for Britain and France to enter the conflict on the side of the Ottomans, and that's because they were keen on limiting Russian power. Now, the fighting didn't just take place in the Black Sea region, it stretched all over Europe, as far north as here. So French and British troops attacked Bomarsund. There were 13,000 troops attacking and only 2,000 defenders. And part of the huge issue was that it was still half finished. This harbour hadn't been completed. So ultimately the fort had to be surrendered. Soldiers were taken captive and they became prisoners of war in the UK and in France. So then a curious situation emerged where France and Britain actually had control of this island, but they didn't want to keep it. They then offered it to Sweden to see if they wanted to take it back, but the Swedish king said no. They thought that reoccupying an island that had been militarily controlled by Russia was bad news and would be tantamount to declaring war, and they did not want any more war with Russia. So the UK and France then proceeded to blow up the fortress against the night sky. Imagine if they hadn't. This would have looked spectacular. Anyway, what followed was peace talks in Paris in 1856. Britain and France, obviously two big empires themselves, wanted to ensure that Russian power was curtailed. So part of the peace talks was that the Åland Islands would be demilitarised. And that is why, to this day, no one is allowed to have a military presence on Åland. Not the Russians, not the Finns, not the Swedes, not the British or the French. And to this day, these islands are demilitarised. I am just going to drive over this bridge because there is one place of interest on the next island that I want to see if I can find, but I'm not sure if I will. I'm not too sure where I've taken myself to. This is a very beautiful but slightly eerie forest, not somewhere where I want to break down. So I've just drove over to the next island called Prästö, and I had to go over a bridge to get here. The reason I wanted to come here was because there's a lot of cemeteries. Some are war cemeteries, so I thought they might be from the days of the fall of Bomarsund. And there's also cemeteries for Orthodox, Lutheran, Catholics, Muslims, Jewish people. So yeah, I thought that might be a bit of an interesting slant to see. But it looks like, basically, I've just drove down this gravel road to get up here, and it looks like you can only access it on a walking trail, 2.5 hours long, which I don't have. I need to return the car, really. So you can go through, you can go on this walk and you can see all of these highlights, including the former pilot station and the Bomarsund Museum. That's where I was. The Russian radio station, foundations of a military hospital, Orthodox, Catholic and Lutheran burial grounds, viewpoints, and the ruins of Prästö Tower. So it sounds really interesting. I definitely would do it if I had more time, but alas, I do not. But I will put the details for this in the blog post that I'm going to write anyway. So if you're interested in knowing what I know about it, then check that out. I thought I will just get out and listen to nature for a moment though. Let's have a very quick scramble up here, just to see if there's anything interesting. So you kind of climb up over the roots of the trees. I might not have made it for the walk, but I do have quite a nice view of Prästö Island here. So Prästö is most well known for its cemeteries. It has lots of Russian military cemeteries, and for the demilitarisation, all military and civil personnel who were stationed at Bomarsund, they were all buried on Prästö Island. It actually got the nickname Island of the Dead because there's so many graveyards on it. Now ultimately, after Bomarsund was lost, the Russians still stayed here, and they decided that they needed a new town. So they decided to establish what is still the island's capital, Mariehamn. That is where I came in on the ferry this morning, and that is where I'm staying. So let's go and have a little look at Mariehamn. So welcome to Mariehamn. It's the next day. I have had a good night's sleep, and I'm just out and about exploring Åland's capital town today. It is the main town of Åland Islands, but it is very small. So this is Mariehamn, and Mariehamn was a planned town. It was founded in 1861, just around 6 years after the Crimean War, and this is when Åland had been demilitarised. It was named after Empress Maria Alexandrovna, who was the wife of Tsar Alexander II, so Mariehamn literally means Marie's harbour. It was built with some imperial ambition. The port largely remains ice-free, unlike a lot of places in the Baltic Sea in the winter, which provided year-round access. It was also meant to guard the edge of Russia's western realm, which this area was at the time. And an interesting fact, unlike other Scandinavian towns, the layout is grid-based, like you see a lot in the US. This was a particular Russian design choice. So I'm here outside the kind of harbour area. This really stretches all the way down this road to where the ferry terminal is, where I came in yesterday, where I'm leaving from tomorrow. What's most interesting is this ship. So before Mariehamn, Åland's importance was mostly military, like Kastelholm under Sweden or Bomarsund under Russia. But after the Crimean War, Åland was demilitarised. So there was a new focus, which was shipping and trade. So from the late 1800s into the early 20th century, this became a shipping and trading town. It was a huge boost to the economy of the islands. So this ship behind me, which hopefully you can see through the trees, is Pommern, and she is a relic of that era. She's a four-masted bark built in 1903, and she carried grain all the way from Europe to Australia. She was part of the Åland-based Ericsson shipping fleet, which is quite well known for carrying on using windjammers even when steamships took over. So to me, all of this shows that before formal political autonomy came, the Åland Islands were always kind of pointing westwards. They were Swedish-speaking, they were Lutheran in religion, like much of Finland was as well, but also they had these trade routes that were connecting them to the rest of the world. So despite their relative geographical isolation, just by the fact that they're an island, they were very well linked with maritime routes. Right, I've bought a ticket, so let's actually go on the ship and see what it's about. So this is the deck of Pommern, a windjammer ship that was built in Scotland in 1903. And the really interesting thing about this museum ship is that she is virtually unchanged since she left the shipyard. So she was built and operated as a cargo ship. She's been to Scandinavia, Chile, Australia, and lots of other places in Europe. So how did she end up here? Well, she was bought by Åland shipowner Gustaf Ericsson in 1923. From then, she was an Åland-based ship. So her base was here, but she went all around the world, connecting Åland to far-flung destinations as far as Australia. She made her last voyage in 1939, so she was active for a good 16 years as an Åland ship. Then she returned home to her own purpose-built dock in Mariehamn Harbour, and she's operated as a museum ship since 1950. So you can see the car lanes there, and then the ferry terminal is just here. And these days, that is how Åland is connected by sea to Stockholm and Helsinki. There is also a small airport, but for me, 100% the best way to get here is by ferry. Built in Scotland, so obviously some of these parts will have come from elsewhere in the UK. So you can see, while Åland is an island, so it is separated from the mainland of both Sweden and Finland geographically, the historic maritime routes meant that it was never really isolated. there were a lot of connections with other maritime powers in Northern Europe, but also as far as South Australia. So I mentioned earlier about the fact that Åland carried on using windjammer ships when a lot of places had started to use steamships. It turned out that this made Åland pretty famous, especially in the UK. People would turn out to see these historic windjammer ships that were still in operation, and they became somewhat of a tourist attraction, or like popularised within media. So in terms of early 20th century seafaring, this is what Åland was most famous for. So this is the Torget, which literally means square. And it's a Saturday, so it's quite busy. It's a few market stalls and things. There's a nice looking al fresco pizza restaurant there. Lots of people out and about enjoying the sunshine, and it's sunny. It's about 14 degrees, but lots of people sort of wearing coats and sitting out enjoying the sun. Now I'm just walking over to this building here, which is the Åland Parliament building. So yes, Åland has its own parliament for around the 29,000 Ålanders who reside here. This is because Åland is an autonomous region of Finland, which means that it has the capability to make up a lot of its own laws, and it's managed differently to the rest of the country. So in 1917, after the Russian Revolution, the country of Finland declared independence from Russia. Now remember that pre-1809, Åland had been controlled by Sweden, but Russia seized them when Russia seized the rest of Finland. So the people of Åland suddenly faced a new reality. They had been governed by Sweden for 600 years and then Russia for over 100. And now they were supposed to be part of this new Finnish republic. But there was a problem. Ålanders didn't speak Finnish, and they were so used to Swedish rule and Swedish control, they didn't want to be governed by Helsinki. So from 1917 to 1920, there was a big campaign to rejoin Sweden, and most of the people in Åland were very much in favour of it. So they gathered petitions which were signed by the majority of the population. So they argued that as a Swedish-speaking nation, they had the right to choose which country they wanted to be in, and it made much more logical sense that it would be Sweden. And remember, this was just after World War I, when empires were breaking down across Europe, so this was a very hot topic in the continent at the time. Sweden supported the idea and were happy to have Åland as part of their country again, and it looked like Åland might change countries and rejoin Sweden. So why didn't they? Well, quite simply, Finland didn't want them to. They refused to let Åland go and saw Åland as part of its historical territory. And Finland had just got independence from Russia, and they didn't want to start losing areas just after. It did escalate a little bit. There were military manoeuvres, strong press campaigns, and even fears of a diplomatic crisis between Finland and Sweden, who had always had a very close relationship. So the issue was actually sent to the newly set up League of Nations in 1921. This was the world's first international peacekeeping organisation. And in 1921, the League of Nations declared that Åland would remain part of Finland, but with some very important stipulations. Number one, the islands would remain Swedish-speaking. Swedish would be the main language, and there would be no requirement to teach or speak Finnish. Number two, it would have full internal autonomy. So Åland is able to settle most of its internal matters on its own without talking to Helsinki. This isn't the case for national matters. Pretty much everything that happens on the islands, the Parliament gets the final say in. And in echoes of 1856, the League of Nations stipulated that there would be a permanent ban on militarisation. And 100 years later, this is still holding up. Who's this guy? Julius Sundblom, Rest of Ålandsfolk. Following Finland's declaration of independence, he became one of the leading figures of the Åland movement. He actually was arrested by Finnish police and was sent to prison. But in 1921, he became the first speaker of the Lagtinget, which is the Swedish word for the parliament. And part of Åland's autonomy means creating its own flag. So this is the Åland flag here. So it's a blue background with a red cross and a yellow border. Interestingly here, next to it is the Finnish flag, next to that is the Swedish flag, then you've got the Danish flag, the flag of the Faroe Islands, and the US flag. Interesting combination. So this is the Mariehamn Library, and as you can see it says bibliotek, which is the Swedish word. The Finnish word is kirjasto, which is very, very different. Swedish and Finnish are not related at all. Finnish is a very unique language. Its only real similar languages are Estonian and Hungarian, but Finnish and Hungarian are quite separate as well. And this is a big thing that Ålanders were fighting for when they were having the battle for autonomy, because they didn't want to be in a situation where they became part of Finland and then they had to change their language. So I walked into the library now, and again, as you can see, there's books are all in Swedish. Now I must say, I only know about 5 words in Swedish and I think maybe 1 in Finnish. So expert just at working out what is Swedish and what is Finnish, but this says Finnish language. There is a Finnish language book section. And then in the kids section there is a Finnish kids story section, but there is also Arabic, Ukrainian, French, German, Spanish, Russian and English. I read this in English. Don't think I'll try and read it in Swedish. So while I'm sure that many people do speak Finnish because for work-related reasons, for relationship-related reasons, or just for language-related reasons, there is no obligation to speak Finnish or learn Finnish, and it is very much treated like a foreign language here, as much as English is. And I've made it to the beach, Baltic Sea, and I'm going to dip my feet in to see how cold it really is. Whew. That is not warm, although once your feet have been in for a few seconds, you do get used to it. Whew. So this is the glorious Lilla Holmen, and it is connected to the main island of Åland by a bridge. Lots of the islands are connected in this way, but there are also loads of ferries that you can take around the islands. Now, I've only had a couple of days here, so I haven't had a huge amount of time to really get to the grips of Åland life and Åland culture. But I hope I have managed to scratch the surface of what makes this a really fascinating destination. It's not just the Swedish language speaking, it's the demilitarisation that is so interesting. I have travelled from London to here without flying over the last 5 days. I spent 4 nights on transport. A lot of videos from that will already be up, so feel free to check out my full playlist. So I think I'm going to spend the rest of this afternoon relaxing. But what I do want to show you is the ferry to get from Åland back to Stockholm, because it is really beautiful. So I will pick this video back up tomorrow, and I'm going to enjoy my afternoon in the sunshine until then. Ferry arrived 10 minutes ago and we're already off, saying goodbye to Åland and to Mariehamn. It looks really beautiful. This ferry up here, you can see on the horizon, that was a Silja Line ferry that has already departed, and these are all the forests of Åland, and then the port is just there. Got the deck to myself this time of morning, but it is 4:45, so I'm envious of everyone tucked up in their cabin, definitely. Here we go. What a lovely little place. And the sun is just coming up there. Just caught it. I guess this is as good a place as any to finish off this video. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to see a full tour of this ferry, I actually went on the same one to get to Åland. So make sure you check this out, it will be somewhere here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and stay tuned for my next video in Stockholm. See you next time, bye.